I want to welcome everyone who is here and thank you for giving up part of your Saturday to join us for the 5th installment of Under the Baobab, Conversations in Community and World History. I'm Laura Mitchell. I'm the president of the World History Association, and it's an honor to have you all in this virtual space and to be part of a vibrant intellectual community that's finding new ways to work during an unprecedented global pandemic, and historic political protests, both in the US and around the world. I'm speaking to you today from Irvine, California, which is located on the homelands of the Ajachamen and Tongva peoples, who in the face of ongoing settler colonialism, continue to claim their place and act as stewards of their ancestral lands, just as they have for the past 8,000 years. This is a series of online gatherings, and it's part of the WHA's response to the COVID-19 pandemic and to the groundswell of anti-racist activism this year. In the absence of our annual meeting, like many of the regional affiliates of the WHA, we're getting together on Zoom to talk about research, teaching, and social justice. Couple of highlights: the Southeast World History Association is holding its annual meeting next weekend on the theme of catalysts of social change. It's online, and you can find event details in the program as well as register to attend at www.sewha.org. The World History Association of Texas, which has the best acronym ever, it's WHAT, W-H-A-T, is hosting its annual meeting on the 20th of February next year on the theme A World of Things, Consumerism, Consumption, and Commodities. Paper proposals the call for papers has just opened, and proposals are due December 1st. You can find WHAT online by searching for them on Facebook. As a resource for others who can't make it at this particular time, this session is being recorded. I want to put a call out there for anyone who has ideas about future online gatherings or publications that WHA might want to take on. Please let us know at info@thewha.org. Finally, I want to invite all of you to connect to the WHA through social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can get updates about new blog posts, which is another channel of communication we've opened up during the pandemic. A little bit of housekeeping. Please keep your microphone muted during the presentation sessions to minimize background noise. Feel free to use the chat function to connect with colleagues and to ask questions of the panelists. We are going to have question and answer time. They'll give you directions about that. And you can either raise your hand, waving like this, using the raise hand function in the participants bar, or send a question via chat. Now I want to turn over the floor to Candice Goucher, who's Professor Emerita at Washington State University, Vancouver. Candice is both a historian and an archaeologist, an Africanist and a world historian, a Caribbeanist and a food historian. She's a founding member of the editorial collective that drives the blog Food in World History. You should go check that out if you haven't already. She's the author of a world history textbook, Journeys from Past to Present, and the unparalleled documentary series, Bridging World History, both of those in collaboration with Linda Walton. For those looking for her most recent book, it is Congo Te, World History, A World History of Caribbean Food. It's a fantastic book, and I urge you to check it out if you haven't seen it already. Candice is a long-standing member of the WHA, and as anyone who's been to a WHA meeting in person knows, she's an insightful conversationalist and a great dancer. Important for in-person. We're not going to make you dance over Zoom, Candice. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Candice, who will introduce the rest of the panel and today's program. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Biography in World History, Sex, Lies, and Secrets. This session of Under the Baobab is going to focus on the critical relationships between the individual in world history and the wider and deeper patterns of change. We are going to discuss, among other things, how as historians, we both keep secrets and we reveal secrets, how historians are learning to navigate the history of gender diversities, and how scholars in general are helping to reframe world history narratives by finding some very fascinating people to focus on. And then we'll talk about some ways that we can hopefully move this discussion of individual biography and let it spill over into the world history classroom. I'm joined by three stellar historians, and I will introduce them one by one, and then set them loose to talk about their own work and their ideas on biography. We've given ourselves about 10 minutes each, and then in the second half of our time together, we'll have an interactive conversation. So our first speaker today is Dr. Bashabi Fraser, who is founder and director of the Scottish Centre of Tagore Studies. She's been Royal Literary Fund Fellow at the University of Dundee and Honorary Fellow at the Centre for South Asian Studies at the University of Edinburgh. She's just written a fascinating biography, and don't let her tell you that she's not a historian, because although she's not trained in history, she's written a wonderful history of Tagore, which was published last year by Reaction Books in their Critical Lives series. Tagore, of course, was the first non-Westerner to win a Nobel Prize in literature in 1913. And in her wonderful book, Professor Fraser has demonstrated how the life of Tagore reflects these larger processes and patterns of world history. Tagore influenced a very large number of individuals, from Helen Keller to Maria Montessori, to other Nobel Peace Prize winners, in many ways anticipating the global connections of the modern world that were only just coming into being. Bashabi is joining us from Scotland. Thank you for spending your Saturday evening with us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Candice, for that very flattering introduction. I hope I can live up to it. I still will say I feel an imposter. I'm not a historian. My subject is English literature and creative writing. But I want to first thank Candice for inviting me to join this prestigious panel with Dr. Yaari Felber-Seligman and Dr. Suzanne Litrel, and I'm really looking forward to learning a lot and being enriched from this discussion and interchange. I will briefly be talking about my research and writing as I came to do this biography after I was approached by the commissioning editor of Reaction Books, who asked me to write a biography of Tagore, and I thought, another biography of Tagore? Why on earth? And then when I started researching, I realized that the last composite biography had been written by Dr. Robinson in 1995 in English. There have been other Bengali biographies after that, 9 volumes by Prashant Kumar Pal and 4 volumes by Prabhat Kumar Mukhopadhyay, 2003 and 2014, respectively. And then within that time, what has happened is, though there have been biographies focusing on his educational institution by Uma Das Gupta, an intellectual biography by Sabyasachi Bhattacharya, there hasn't been a holistic history of his life and time since 1995. But since 1995, the Rabindra Bhavana, which is the archival center of Tagore's work at his International University at Vishabharati, they have digitized a lot of his manuscripts, his letters, his notebooks from him and his family and his close associates, and they became available. The other thing that happened was in 2001, the copyright that Vishabharati owned of all Tagore's work was lifted. There was a plethora of publications, and you really had to be cautious as a scholar. Then there were films by people like Satyajit Ray in 1961, Mujibur Rahman in 2011, Partha Bhattacharya in America in 2014, which actually traced Tagore's life and work. The focus on gender is much more recent. And I would like to mention two scholars, Malashri Lal and Sanjukta Dasgupta, who have written quite a lot. And when we come to the next part of the decision, we'll definitely go to the gender focus of this session. I was also quite fortunate, and I'm grateful to the Indian Council for Cultural Relations for giving me a fellowship, which enabled me to do my studies in the National Libraries of India and Britain, and the various libraries in India, like the Nehru Memorial Library and Sahitya Academy Library. So that's how I went on with my work. I also owe a huge debt to the Scots collection donated by two Tagore scholars, Indranath Chaudhary and William Radite. And I must also add my father, Bimalendra Bhattacharya, who's also a professor, a geographer. So who was Rabindranath Tagore? He was born in 1961 at Jorashako, the Tagore family home. He even died there, which he didn't intend because he loved his own place, Shantiniketan, where he set up his institutions. It was 3 years after the British Crown took over the Indian territories. So Rabindranath, who died in 1941, actually died as a British subject. So when he won the Nobel Prize, he was the subject of a subject nation. So we have to remember that. He says, I was born in what was then the metropolis of British India. My ancestors came floating to Calcutta upon the earliest tide of the fluctuating fortunes of the East India Company. The conventional code of life for our family thereupon became a confluence of three cultures, the Hindu, Mohammedan, and British. And he actually isn't referring to religious divisions, but rather to cultural affinities here. So Tagore's life and work actually embody this confluence. And he, as he tries to bring divergent cultures together, both at home and in the world. Tagore's family was the epicenter of the Bengal Renaissance, a religious, socio-cultural, and literary reform movement, which spread across India and led her into the modern era. Jorashako, the family seat where Tagore grew up, was an was a hive of imaginative creativity and cultural innovation with various members, both women and men, across three generations, who actively took part in transformative arts, ideas, fashions, and freedoms. And freedoms becomes a great word for us in this session, which has been introduced by Kerry already. Rabindranath Tagore with Mahatma Gandhi was a nation builder. They were the architects of modern India. As the Indian Prime Minister, India's first independent India's Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru said, I think the richness of India's age-long cultural genius, which can throw up in the same generation two such master types, typical of her in every way, yet representing different aspects of her many-sided personality. And as Ashish Nandi has said, in rejecting Tagore, one rejects an important part of the modern consciousness of India, which Tagore embodied and which my study tries to reaffirm. My biography actually offers, I hope, a composite and critical reassessment of Tagore as the Renaissance man. I felt that many misconceptions and myths about Tagore, which had been circulating unhampered, needed to be addressed to retrieve the full story of the global figure. And you can ask me about these myths during the discussion. To give you a full story of a global figure. So Rabindranath has been placed in his lifetime through his work. And the book, as Candice said, was published by Reaction Books in London, but the American edition is published by Chicago University Press, and I hope it's cheaper there. However, this wasn't an easy task because I was steeped in Rabindranath Tagore. As a Bengali, you hear his songs, you dance to his songs, his dance dramas, you read his work. But what struck me was his amazing versatility, his modernity, his continuing relevance, and his ability to touch every emotion within us through his writing, his music, and his art. The rebel in me felt an affinity with the rebel in Rabindranath and the values he set by freedoms. But could I distance myself enough to view his life and work objectively. He hated walls. And with that, I think a lot of us sympathize because they divide city from country, nation from nation, people from people, and create the other. He believed in the unity of man in the creative principle in mankind, a potential which every individual has and has to be realized. His faith came from his religion of man, which is a deep humanism with an unshakable faith in humanity. This is what makes him an optimist and a romantic. What he wrote in his 80 years is a colossal body of work: poetry, dance dramas, novels, short fiction, plays, operas, travelogues, essays, sermons, 2,200 songs, 2,400 paintings. It's not possible to read or analyze his work for any one individual in a lifetime, but he wrote it. And maybe if he wasn't so close to us, in time, we might have thought he had a whole school doing his work for him. The fact that he found time, in spite of all this, to build institutions, a school, an international university, a rural reconstruction center, and cooperatives. He also wrote educational text. Any other Nobel laureate who wrote primers, and of course lectures on articles on various subjects, 4,000 letters. When did he find the time? And he implemented his vision through multiple projects, which makes him the true Renaissance man, the myriad-minded man. He traverses 2 centuries, the Victorian and the modern. And the journeys he makes, literary, emotional, intellectual, and physical, through an intensely active life, reflects a man and his nation's history vis-a-vis the world. Edward Thompson, Tagore's biographer and critic, had said of Tagore, not a man only, but an age had made its way at last into history. He had summed up in himself a whole age in which India had moved into the modern world. In my biography, I have brought out, I hope, Tagore's involvement in public life in India as an Indian, in the Indian nationalist movement, such as his involvement with the Swadeshi movement, the indigenous movement protesting against the first partition of Bengal, his public debates with Gandhi, his renunciation of his knighthood in 1919 after the Amritsar massacre. So when he won the Nobel Prize in 1913, the first non-Westerner, as Candice said, he was, as we must remember, not in a free country. He died before India became independent, but he was already a household name in Bengal and a much revered name in India. But the Nobel Prize pushed him, much to his surprise, onto the international stage. Henceforth, Tagore, who had written the bulk of his work in Bengali, consciously chose English for his lectures, talks, essays, and letters in a self-imposed one-man mission to bring the East and West closer together through dialogue, which you are doing today through the World History Association, based on mutual understanding and respect. He visited debatably around 34 countries, many of which have splintered since then. And he always on invitation from leading intellectuals, thinkers, political leaders, and cultural groups. He cultivated what Michael Collins, the post-colonialist, has called the politics of friendship, with leading intellectuals, artists, and thinkers of his time. He was a man far ahead of his times. He realized that rural India needed resuscitation. And to that effect, he sent his own son, his Rothindranath, his son's friend, Santa, and his son-in-law to study not at Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard, but to the University of Illinois in Urbana to study agriculture and husbandry and bring the knowledge and expertise back to India. Tagore visited America 5 times with lecture tours 1912, 1960, 1920, 1929, 1930. On his first visit, when he was a guest of Professor Arthur and Mace Seymour, his very warm hosts, he probably thought of establishing his international university, Vishabharati, looking at Urbana, because that's where he was. And he named his university Vishwabharati, which means, whose motto is, where the whole world meets in one nest, a place for national and international exchange, which makes him a historical figure in his own Shantiniketan, the abode of peace. It was in America in 1920 that he first met Helen Keller, whom Candice mentioned, and Leonard Elmhurst, who was studying agricultural science at Cornell University. And Tagore invited the latter to come and take up the leadership of his Rural Reconstruction Center at Sriniketan, the abode of well-being, the sister institution of Shantiniketan, which Elmhurst did after he had finished his degree. Of Tagore, Ezra Pound wrote, he sang Bengal into a nation. Gandhi said of Tagore that he is national because he's truly international. And I will finish with the message Albert Einstein wrote for the Golden Book of Tagore, brought out by his friends to celebrate Tagore's 70th birthday. I quote, "Thou hast served mankind all through a long and fruitful life, spreading everywhere a gentle and free thought in a manner such as the seers of thy people have proclaimed as the ideal." This is poetry by Einstein to the poet, who in his lifetime was simply known internationally as the poet. Thank you.
Thank you, Bashabi. I'm really looking forward to our further discussion with you in a few minutes. Tagore is so fascinating, and I really loved your book. Okay, it's my turn. So I have recently finished the manuscript for a 4-volume project called Women Who Changed the World, to be published next year, 2020 by 2021. Yes, we will survive 2020, by ABC Clio. I signed the contract for the project the same month that I retired from 35 years of university teaching. What was I thinking? Over the course of the past 2 years, this project, which has inspired our gathering today, involved more than 100 dedicated scholars, and I see quite a few of them have joined our audience today, including the next 2 speakers. Fully 1/2 of the project's 200 biographical essays were completed in the midst of a global pandemic. And anyone who has begun and finished a major multi-year project knows what I'm talking about when I say that some nights I went to bed feeling as if I should be looking for the exit door of purgatory. So one of the dangers, I think, of biographies is that they most often relate extraordinary lives, exceptional lives, right? Not simply ordinary people. So having a collection of those lives, 200 biographies, might enable us to find some historical patterns. And I think one critical use of biography can be providing insights into the patterns of obstacles that women faced or men faced, the structures of inequality, the patterns of their strategies as they tried to overcome those obstacles and achieve success. So let me start at the beginning. Being born into an elite family, of course, never hurt one's chances of securing a position to change the world. Queens and scientists, musicians alike sometimes inherited opportunities by being born in the right opportune place or time. Yet I think many women, such as, for example, Mary Wollstonecraft, perhaps were self-taught, and the first female millionaire in the United States, African-American entrepreneur, Madam C.J. Walker, was self-made. Well into the 20th century, women around the world confronted their very limited access to education and economic opportunity. as well as the forces that sometimes sought to silence and erase them from history books. So as children, many of these women sought opportunities to read and write. Literacy and presumably skilled orality is one theme, I think, that goes back at least 4,000 years. And at early ages, many did so, even when their societies denied them formal access to education. They did so with persistence, and that's reflected in the case, for example, of Queen Victoria, whose daily entries in her private diaries began when she was only 13 years old and continued until a few days before she died at age 81. They run to 43,000 pages. They were prolific. Other children whose lives would change the world eventually began, for example, to observe nature at a very young age, intensely. They began to practice the piano for 5 hours, for many hours a day at the age of 5. Or they sought the elegance of mathematical equations or began to engage in artistic production, all before they even reached adulthood. So you have this pattern, I think, of very young and forceful beginnings as young children even, driven to make a difference, driven with their curiosity. What about the endings? Well, historians have estimated that life expectancy for most women in most parts of the world was pretty much the same, about 30 years before the 18th century. And of course, women faced political assassins and guillotines and martyrdom by fire and firing squads. But if women survived infancy and childhood diseases, then the single most dangerous thing that they did typically was to give birth. And as the tragic death of, which we may hear a little bit more about, the Empress of Brazil, Leopoldina, suggests, she died in childbirth, or the 25-year-old Indonesian feminist, Raden Ajeng-Kartini, confirms. So of course, many women managed to avoid marriage, and global industrialization eventually created changes in mortality rates, but gender inequalities persisted. So in between birth, childhood, and death, what gave women a chance to succeed in changing the world? In my opinion, it's all about relationships. Women's lives absorbed the presence of family bonds and social connections, their challenges, and their opportunities that they afforded. Personal relationships with friends and husbands, other individuals, parents, lovers, co-wives, siblings, all furthered women's activities and ignited their successes. So individuals gained camaraderie and support from belonging to social movements, from belonging to resistance efforts, reading groups, religious orders, families, institutions, both formal and informal. For example, the nature artist Maria Sibylla Merian in the 17th century got her start from a family of artists and publishers. But she traveled alone with her daughter from Amsterdam all the way to South America. And there the mother and daughter worked together in Suriname, where they described the insects singing and the bugs jumping out like shining candles while they painted them and observed them and made natural history contributions. There was the Italian painter, Artemisia Gentileschi, who in the 16th century was trained by her father, actually 17th century, she was trained by her father, or the Chinese poet artist, Guan Daosheng, who in the 13th century was afforded entry into elite court art patronage through her diplomat husband. The astronomer Caroline Herschel, who in the 18th century first calculated the observations of stars for her brother, William. So critical human connections such as these in turn helped shape the possibilities of women in world history. I think relationships as well with the unseen world, relationships with deities and ancestors, divinities, gods and goddesses also help to determine the outcome of women's more ancient lives. And we know whether they were derived from the Yaxchilan religion of Lady Shark in the 8th century in Chiapas, Mexico, or the Babylonian Adadgupi in the 5th and 6th century BCE, the experience of the poet Karakal Amayar in India in the 6th century. These women found status, they found comfort, they found sanction, and they found ecstasy in unseen worlds that they inhabited spiritually. So women find their strength, they find their opportunities in households, in families, in groups, fashioned by their own personality, by their own talent, by their political commitment or religious commitment, intellectual commitment. The problem of, I think, elite women, about whom we know, of course, more in the recorded past, is that their actions, I think, have of necessity been more public, and their privilege and wealth, I believe, have skewed the historical lens of gender away from much more subversive, much more widespread, and yes, more secretive accomplishments of other women. So I would argue that too often the official versions of biographies are skewed by sex and gender and secrets and lies. Contradictory portraits are common, and so are political lies about women, lies that make the 2020 campaign seem like playtime. Was the Roman Byzantine Empress Irene a martyr or a saint? Or was she a violent and ambitious tyrant? Was Winnie Mandela a courageous, inspirational leader or a disgraced divorced wife? Was the pharaoh male or female? We have many controversies, some of which we might delve into later today. I think it's also important to note that women from one generation learned from another. One needs only consider the longevity of social and political movements, from suffragists to anti-colonial freedom fighters, which suggests, I think, that there are lessons to be learned from the lives of other women across time and space, and that those lessons have been another form of making history and of historical memory having a life of itself. I think the gap between lives lived and lives remembered can be very formidable. Historians might find themselves doing the equivalent of what the modern writer Nicole Tersigni quipped, "Let me explain your lived experience to you." Yet without that persistent oral tradition, without the indelible stone inscriptions of even subsequent generations of mostly male scholars who remarkably recorded their memories, the accomplishments of many women would have been lost. The world's oldest known author, Enheduanna, the poet I mentioned, Guan Dao Sheng, or the Bhakti poet saint Karakal Amayar, all had their lives recorded by men, and otherwise they would not have survived. So I guess to close, I hope that these 4 volumes, Women Who Changed the World, when they do appear next year, will similarly provide some inspirational narratives for future generations of women seeking to change the world, and including the lineup we have with us today. So thank you. Our next speaker is Yaari Felber-Seligman from the History Department at City College in New York, who will speak about their current projects, focusing on the opportunities and the challenges for contextualizing gender diversities and individuals in early African history, as well as world history. I had the pleasure of working with Yaari on several essays for the Women Who Changed the World project, and I learned so much from them. I'm really grateful for the ways that we were able to stretch and redefine discussions of gender across the 4 volumes. Today, they are going to be talking about how the construction of gender varies across world cultures, across world history, and how does gender diversity stretch and challenge our historical assumptions and our labels. So Yaari, over to you.
Hello, everyone. I am so grateful to at least be seeing all of you virtually, and just a warm thank you to Candice and Laura, the rest, Carrie, the rest of the WHA, and my fellow panelists and everyone listening. It's just, if we can't meet in person, it's so wonderful to be part of this warm and productive community again. I love visuals, so I'm going to share a couple slides as I talk. Doing that now. Oh, hang on one second. Anyway, so I'm really happy to be here, tech issues notwithstanding, and New York City street noise notwithstanding. And I wanted to jump into really thinking about, as Candice said, this challenge of gender diversities in history. How do we move from our 21st century categories, our often inherited, whether we resist them or not, recent Western historical ideas about gender binary, even encoded into the English language, and really make space for some of the individuals in cultures that reckon gender very differently, as well as the individuals in all societies who did and challenged existing categories of sexuality and gender. I'm starting with a fun visual, which is a map courtesy of PBS Independent Lens, showing gender diverse individuals in history. And for students, I love this. It's an interactive map where when you click on the pin, it shows recent eras in local languages, their ideas about gender and sexual diversity and these terms. And it's a fun way really for me and others to really reframe this plurality that I strive in my teaching and in my research to bring into the classroom and in my collaborations on these entries for Candice and new projects I'll talk about. So I'm really coming to this as an assistant professor of African comparative world and LGBTQ history, a scholar like all of us, I'm assuming in the room, who really strives to credit and contextualize the intersectional life experiences of individuals. And this is this Rosie the Riveter intersectional style is courtesy of this great Etsy artist, Taylor Fetter. Who did a really great job. But I'm also interested in pivoting our language in terms of how we narrate history, how we do history and research history, away from Western-centric assumptions coming through the last couple hundred years that often default to the biological sex of an individual as their default gender, as the default for describing them in terms of narrative pronouns and the like, to really looking at the individual's lived experience is with gender expression, gender identity. And of course, these are also 21st century terms that I'm seeking to really ground and contextualize in the past. And gender identity, of course, is one's innate sense of self in 21st century style, which may or may not match how that individual interfaces with the public, their gender expression, their choices of names, pronouns, comportment, clothing, their way of moving through the world. And so as I was working on this, I was very much as a cultural historian cognizant of the cultural construction, both of sex and gender, and how this varies from different societies. And here I'm drawing inspiration from so many scholars. I made myself stick to naming 2 as shout outs on these slides, but Oyonke Oyewume's challenge to static notions of womanhood in African history, pointing to the variability of status, of age, of life cycle and relationships, and how that really needs to infuse our fluid and variable treatment of gender for the early African past before the 1800s or so. I also really pay heed to a lot of calls showing the intersections in the last 500 years of thought between notions of race, ethnicity, sexuality, and gender that C. Riley Snorton does so well when they show the early history of transness and trans identity for people of color in the Americas. So in short, that's just the frameworks I'm really trying to bring into both my teaching and research that center historical subjects' own worldviews and highlight in narrative and framing choices the subject's own agency and how they define themselves, which included gender as well. So on to a few brief examples, but I hope during our conversations I can say more about language and these narrative choices. So for Candice's fabulous volumes, I ended up writing a number of entries, including Wewa and the well-known pharaoh Hatshepsut. And Wewa was a late 19th century Lahama, a two-spirit leader of the Ashiwi, known to outsiders as Zuni Nation. They were an individual whose notion of gender was other than male or female. Their Ashiwi society, like many indigenous peoples, over 100 or so, has been well documented to have notions of gender that went beyond male or female. And in their culture, one came into the world with this idea of gender being unbaked or uncooked, raw. And through life cycles, through coming of age, sometimes through vision quests and trances, one discovered their actual fit into gender, whether that's male, female, Lahama, or other forms. And I could go on and on. I'm not going to because I'm conscious of time, but they were a dynamic leader who used their cultural position as a two-spirit figure to really try to bridge the very fraught and growing even more fraught politics of US settler colonialism and the Ashiwi Zuni nations' really vulnerable position. This is the rise of dialogue about the civilizing mission, emphasis on trying to start assimilating indigenous people and their children into Western notions of sex, class, gender, and the like. But nonetheless, Wewa was a dynamic leader who for a moment in time was able to partially forge a more respectful dialogue, especially through their friendship with Matilda Cox Stevenson, one of the first female professional anthropologists. And Wewa went to Washington in 1886. And anyway, centering on this individual's gender identity really helped ground their activism in their attempts to resist settler colonialism and the like. Pharaoh Hatshepsut, so much has already been said about this pharaoh, but I'm working on this dynamic, gender creative New Kingdom pharaoh. I deliberately chose to ground their apparent gender identity and how that was expressed. And, you know, as Candice mentioned, for elite figures, we have such a wealth of sources. But in this pharaoh's case, they were all produced for public, whether elite or commoner or both, consumption. So this was a pharaoh who deliberately, as they came and solidified their power, invoked both genders, male and femaleness, in a way that seemed to tap into notions of the divine, this idea of dual and fluid gender gods, and these powerful ideas about, at certain key times, like during reincarnation, ancient Egyptians actually could transcend and move between genders. And this was critical to New Age, New Kingdom Egypt's ideas about rebirth. So with all of this, centering gender in my analysis, following this pharaoh's lead about gender duality and how I describe them, I really tried to emphasize both their worldviews, but how their worldviews help them solidify power, becoming one of the most prolific builders, artistic trendsetters, and really long-lasting pharaohs of, you know, the fraught and turbulent era of New Kingdom, you know, expansionist Egypt. And so there's so much more I can say, but let me just give one final example and then wrap up. In my own research, of course, this is where I'm a sort of outsider gadfly in the room of this wonderful conversation. I'm not usually working with named individuals, but rather unnamed historic Africans. But nonetheless, a lot of the questions and methodological challenges and struggles I face to really contextualize their views versus historic Europeans who wrote about them versus 21st century paradigms for thinking about this have much in common with some of the biographic challenges. So just in one brief example, a snippet of some of the sources, I turned to the potential alongside European documentary records and some of available African accounts when they're available. In writing, I turned to oral history and the like. I turned to historical linguistics and the potential and the metaphors and the associations about terms applied to these gender diverse Africans, such as this root word of banda for the noun chimbanda, and look into some of its embedded meanings. In this case, some later periods, long-lasting positive conceptions, individuals about power, individuals who are healers, dynamic individuals, as we to start approaching with a lot more research down the line with the second book project, some of what I hope to contextualize about historic Africans' worldview during and hopefully even before the era of fraught and turbulent Atlantic West Central African contact. So I'm going to wrap up here, but I think when we're looking at biography, whether we're looking at gender diverse individuals or complex individuals who straddled different worlds, whether it's global, modern, pre-modern, and the like, there is so much potential in the classroom, not only to highlight how societies did identities, items of power and status, how societies in this case did gender and gender diversity, but also really to ground discussions in some of these different ways that comparative world history opens up conversations, both about similarities and differences between cultures. And finally, that issue that I think matters to students in 2020, 2021, and onward more so than ever, really getting a sense of the complexity of our world and some of the perhaps antecedents or parallels in the past, as well as that critical notion of differences. And finally, how the last 500 years, of course, has traced historical production about all of that. So I'm going to leave it on these big thoughts. I'm going to stop screen sharing, but I'm just thrilled to be part of this conversation.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Just pull up. Wow, okay. So our last speaker, our next speaker is Dr. Suzanne Litrel. Currently a researcher with the American Historical Association, who will discuss her projects that are rethinking world history through biography. Full disclosure, Suzanne was also a contributor to Women Who Changed the World, and I promise to you, I did not invite her to contribute until she'd finished her dissertation. But one of the marks of, I think, a world historian is someone like Suzanne who is willing to tackle the biography of a woman from China and a woman from Brazil. And her enthusiasm has been infectious in this project. So one of her current projects is actually a new edition of a classic reference work on notable Latin American women. And in her remarks, she'll also challenge us to think about how we not only create biography, but how we use biography in world history classrooms. So over to you, Suzanne.
Thank you so much, Candice. It's so wonderful to see so many familiar faces. So many of you held my hands through the dissertating process. You should know that you got a big chunk of my acknowledgements. So thank you so much. And Candice, it's such a pleasure to join in on this conversation. And I'm actually, given my work this year and elsewhere, now I'm going to screen share because I too am quite visual, and I have what I hope, how's this? Does this show up well for you?
Yes.
Okay. So I have here something I hope for the world history instructors. I have, those of you who know me know I taught 14 years at the high school level, and then it's been about 6 years at the undergraduate level. So I'm always thinking about how to apply what it is I come across. And I do think that teaching makes us better scholars as well. So I've always liked to tell my students that history, especially world history, is akin to traversing a great wide ocean. And this journey is made all the more manageable when we can anchor ourselves to a moment in the time and see what comes into focus. And this includes, of course, our traveling companions, our guides, and it's where biography can come in. In a 1992 AHA Perspectives article, Anne Warren noted that biography serves as a good, in her words, initial entry point to unfamiliar worlds, rendering people, in her words, accessible and knowable. And I found that relatable stories of people really sparked my own students' imagination and encouraged them to navigate their own learning. But where to start? On my own research, I have to admit that I've held biography at arm's length. For some of the reasons that Candice has mentioned earlier on in this discussion. But yet such works helped me to track down really critical stories and figures. So as long as we're at least open to the purpose and the intent of a particular biography, it can in fact help chart the way, be it in teaching or in research. Here I have a few of the women I investigated this year for both the revision of notable women of Latin America and as well for Candice's project. And in thinking with where world history instructors might be in the semester, and the fact that Portuguese America, Brazil for some, seems less accessible than Spanish America, I'd like to take the case of Maria Leopoldina, the first Empress of Brazil. This Archduchess of Austria has been portrayed as mother of Brazil, martyr, hastened to an early death by the cruel impulses of her philandering husband. And a quick scan of survey textbooks indicates that she receives at most a line, maybe a paragraph in a Latin American history survey textbook. So what can her biography how can her biography offer us another approach to the long 19th century? What can her story reveal about revolution, transatlantic exchange, and more? So at the most basic level, for me, I think in teaching, there are three ways we can use biography in world history instruction. One is as a conversation starter. And by the way, some of the slides that I'm sharing, if you'd like to use them in the classroom, I can get them to you or we'll figure out a way. But here is one way. Whoops, trying to move on to the next. Here we go. We can dive right in and we can ask, well, what does revolution actually look like? Is revolution, for instance, in the case, we can ask, and by the way, I'm thinking teaching remotely and face-to-face, we can have our students make a case for, well, this is an example of revolution to the left, Maria Leopoldina meeting with the Council of State. José Bonifacio was her minister, was minister to Dom Pedro at the time. And it was at this moment that they decided that Brazil should separate from Portugal. Is what came out of this discussion revolution? The fact that Maria Leopoldina, José Bonifacio, and the British ambassador to Brazil sent letters to Dom Pedro, the Prince of Brazil at this time, the Prince of Portugal at this time. And in fact, he himself at this 5 days later decided that was it. It was time to separate once and for all. And here are two iconic, this is an iconic image of Latin American revolution. We have a man on a horseback with a sword in air. Is this, and the grito do Ipiranga, the shout or the cry of Ipiranga, independence or death? Is this revolution? So here we can use biography. We can take a look at Leopoldina at the table, making a decision with her ministers, or have students take a look and compare and make arguments for either side. So here we have biography. We can use her story to investigate which one. Or, oops, excuse me, I have to. Or is biography, we can also use biography to add context to a time, a place, and an event. And the very subject's life actually reflects these. Candice mentioned the importance of friendships and roles and responsibilities. And here we have Maria Leopoldina in her numerous roles. If we trace her story, we really see the story of transformation from daughter, sister, mother, wife, princess, regent, when Dom Pedro was away from Rio de Janeiro, trying to shore up support for the independence movement or quell rebellion, she stepped into his shoes. And then finally, as empress. We can look at the story, we can look at her friendships. One shared theme with her friendships with Maria Graham, the English traveler, from whose travel diary we can read much about Leopoldina. She shared with, excuse me, Maria Graham, Jacques Araújo, José Bonifacio, a shared love of nature, a shared love of mineralogy. And the three engaged in lively discussions. What does this tell us about this time? And we can also, and I hope we get back to this, take a look at her own letters home and witness her transformation to pro-independence sympathizer. Her initial letters, of course, were full of, were clearly marked by homesickness, but by the very end, she was a staunch supporter of Brazil's independence, and indeed wrote letters home, trying to shore up support there as well. So when we think about the story, we can think about Brazil's independence from Portugal. And when we think of this revolutionary era, her story lends a little more, to me, dynamism to the event. Brazil is often cast in a very different light than the so-called stable succession relative to upheaval in Spanish America. But through and with Leopoldina, we can examine Brazil's internal fault lines, post-independent fragility, as Leopoldina, now empress, fired off letters in an attempt to gain recognition for Brazil as an independent state in its own right. She connected the House of Habsburg and the House of Braganza, and that connection helped sort of push off the British for a short while at least. This is one way to circumvent their growing power in Brazil. And her life offers us a jumping point for many different discussions. Of course, comparative Atlantic revolutions, naturalist and scientific writings and inquiries of the day, the use of travel narratives, and connections to 20th century nation building and more. And so if we take a quick look at this, at these two paintings, two very different images of womanhood at this time, or of the roles of women at this time. To the left, we see Maria as not as emotional as women have been portrayed throughout history. Here she seems dispassionate, logical even, as she, of noble bearing, one might say, you know, and to the right, an iconic image of motherhood, the matriarch surrounded by all her children, submissive to her husband, but doing her duty, and that was to procreate. But I'd like to call your attention to the dates in which these paintings were created, and the fact that the winner, they were created for the centenary of Brazil's independence from Portugal. And I'd like to call the attention to the fact that the winner of the exposition was in fact a female painter. And again, this helps to contextualize what was happening in Brazil at this time. Brazil, possibly as in its attempt to become, in its modernizing days, still early days of the Republic, and so on. And so here, Paul Vane reminds us that history, and I quote, is anecdotal. It interests by recounting. And biography, of course, serves this function through relatable anecdotes, and in this way help to draw overlooked stories into the history, into the currents of world history. And so finally, I can share with anyone who likes, I have some teachable resources that are available online, the first and the third, that students might delve into, and instructors as well. And with that, I will stop my share and turn it back to discussion. So thank you.
Yay. Wow. Well, these individual presentations have really left my head spinning in appreciation. I think as a whole, all of our speakers have suggested some radical possibilities for the contours of world history, as well as some of the fun of writing and researching biographies. As promised, I want to move into this second half of our program. We have about a half hour left, which will be a discussion of the role of biography in world history, as well as the role of world history, biography in the world history classroom. So I invite at this point the audience participants to use the chat function to ask questions or make comments. Don't be afraid to jump in, but let me turn first to Bashabi to give you a chance to kind of bring your quick, screening of Tagore's life, which was so global and so amazing, but to bring it into the focus of his relationships with women. You have done just such a stunning job of making suggestions of some of the importance of, critical women that you've uncovered in his life, his mother, his sister-in-law, his female friends in England, his wife, later women who provided him with accommodations and financial support. I'm wondering, how did these women impact Tagore's life and his work, and what were some of the challenges of writing women into this narrative of a man's life? That, you're working in an era within a culture that sanctioned their silence, their invisibility, but clearly they were critical factors. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, well, it's a big question, and I hope I can do some justice to it. I'll start off with the fact of the Tagore family itself and Tagore's various relatives. It's interesting that his mother, Sharoda Devi, she died when Tagore was only 14, and he was quite a lonely child. The reason was Sharoda Devi was actually looking after a huge household of her own children, relatives, visitors who came and stayed, and she was the eldest wife in the household. But what she did was set an example to all the other daughters-in-law in the Tagore household. She actually looked after the cooking herself, in spite of having many servants. The Tagore women were known for their cuisine, inventive cuisine. They were great hostesses, if I may say so. And so they were actually busy in the kitchen themselves, in spite of having all this home help, and they supervised everything. So I think that was one example that was set by Sharoda Devi, and she was really tired of childbirth. I mean, Tagore was the 14th child, so a lot of women at that time died because of too many children. The daughters-in-law came in when they were very young, because it was a time when child marriage was still prevalent in India. And if your girl child crossed a certain age, she was unmarriageable. So that was another difficult thing. So I would like to speak about his sister-in-law, Kadamburi, who came in, who was a little older than Tagore, and she became his playmate and his soulmate. There have been a lot of suggestions that there might have been more than that. It was actually a totally platonic relationship. She was had an amazingly acute literary acumen, and she was a critical reader of Tagore's own work. She was actually the inspiration behind the Tagore household journal, Bharati. And when she committed suicide at the age of 25, suffering from depression, and she was childless, and there were many reasons for this, which I discuss in my book, Bharati actually was discontinued. People within the Tagore household couldn't continue Bharati because she was the impetus behind it, though she wasn't a writer. And she was actually very critical of what Tagore wrote. more or less wrenching the best out of him. So she would say things like, yes, that poem is good, but not as good as Biharilal Chakraborty. So who was the kind of the hero poet of the times. So Tagore's aim was to actually rise above Bihari Chakraborty. And in his evening songs, which he brought out later in life, that's when he actually realized he could find his own voice. So I think Kadambari helped him to find his own voice. The other thing that happened was his second brother, Shotendranath, was the first Indian ICS, so Indian Civil Service. His wife, Ganuda Nandini, was a great feminist, and she actually broke a lot of boundaries for women in India. And she was the first woman who went in an open carriage at a time when women were in Purdah. And she went in an open carriage, which her husband took her in, and it was a scandal, you know, to a government party. The other thing she did was the way you see Indian women wearing the sari today, thrown over the shoulder. And believe me, you can't even climb a tree in a sari the way it's worn now. You might think it's too graceful for that, but actually it's possible to do a lot of things. It's quite a pretty free garment. But it was Ganuda Nandini who adopted the Parsi style and then changed it and altered it to suit a modern woman. And she actually invited the Tagore household women to come to her room to learn how to wear the sari. She also started a journal for children. And of course, it was assumed that for every journal they started, Tagore would be the main contributor. So and there's another woman in from his household, his little niece, Indira Devi. And he came to know her quite intimately in Brighton when he went to stay with Ganuda Nandini and his nephews, Surendranath and Indira Devi. And she was only 5 and Tagore was 18. But a chord was struck because Indira was a great singer, wonderful voice, and they loved their Robi Kaka, their Uncle Robi. And that bond stayed because later on, Indira was a person that Tagore wrote to regularly. In fact, you can find his letters translated as Letters to a Young Poet, translated by Rosinka Chaudhary. But also she was an exponent of Tagore's songs, those 2,200 odd songs. So these are some of the women who inspired him. The other person was Sharna Kumari, his elder sister, who was the first Bengali novelist, woman novelist. And 2 of his nieces, Sharna Kumari's daughters, Hiranmoy and Sharula, were actually Indian nationalists and social workers. So we find that Tagore's household, the women, they were the first people to actually, within the Tagore household, the women actually acted in the plays written by his brother Jyotindranath and Tagore himself. Then the entire Tagore household came to Bengal theatre in the public space to watch a play written by Jyotindranath. And they even transported sofas and armchairs and hookahs and carpets and a screen so that the women could stay behind it. But actually they were entering a public space. So these were the women who kind of moved from the home into the world, as it were. And that's a title, English title of his novel, Ghore Baire, his 1916 novel. Of the international women, do you want me to go on or should I stop there? Would you like to ask a question about them?
Well, it sounds like you have enough material for an entire book on the household of Tagore. But it reminds me, and maybe we can open this up to to everyone, that, the key thing about biography is that it can be so intimate. What level of privacy do we owe historical figures? Women, for example, I included in my project, from Eleanor Roosevelt to Rachel Carson, went to great lengths. They destroyed letters. They went to great lengths to protect their own privacy. And now you have historians writing about their sexuality and other aspects of their private lives. So I think, in a sense, that we're all, as historians, I think there was a question on the chat from Jonathan Reynolds, what about the dangers of bad biography? What about the dangers of going down some of these avenues that maybe aren't so savory? You know, what responsibility do we have as historians? And I'll just open that up to everyone.
Yeah, I actually just want to speak on that a bit. It's a great question. Oh, Jonathan, I can't even tell you. I mean, because this is, I think we all know this too. And I think the key over here is understanding the context in which the biography was written in the first place. Under what circumstances and to what ends. In my own research on Dutch held Brazil, I came across a number of biographies, and then I had to think about, well, you know, I had to really step back and say, all right, I'm sorry? Oh, so when were these items created? Who is being held up? Who's actually writing? In some cases, of course, in the 17th century, you had folks angling for social mobility purposes and hiring scribes, so to speak, or biographers, commissioning biographers to write about them. So that's such a great question. And there was another question, I believe, in the chat about sources about women. There's remarkable work being done now. I can't recommend highly enough Camilla Townsend's Malince's Choices. For those of you, for those who are interested in taking a deeper look at Hernan Cortez's The Life of a Traveler, she did a remarkable job going into the sources in terms of looking at the future she secured for her children. So stepping away from the typical sources and into the record. So that's a piece. So I'll just bring that up. Great question.
Can I jump into is my audio? Okay, good. One of the things that I find so important when we're looking at individuals who led complex identities or gender diverse individuals in this case is really to try to make moves as 21st century historians and students of history to emphasize, or at least get our best guess, how these individuals wanted to be seen and wanted to be remembered. Since most of us, not all of us, but many of us are working in the English language and grammatically gendered language, we often have to make choices that in many African cultures, there is no gender pronouns for third gender. There's only one. So you aren't automatically slotting someone into male or female. And one of the things following the lead of both the trans community, of which I'm a part, but also great recent scholarship, such as, among others, Jen Mannion's book, Female Husbands, A Trans History, really looking at individuals who cannot easily be slotted into a gendered box and choosing to step back as a scholar and use gender neutral language. In this author's case, and in my case, the singular they pronoun, to really try to credit how these individuals move through the world and honor that lived gender choice versus defaulting to what we think we know about, their biological sex and so forth. But just to very briefly answer a question for me, I saw in the chat too, on this topic of language, it also means paying close attention to both how a community or category has been described and how the terms with which historically or in the present they prefer. So for example, many Indigenous First Nations peoples protested against earlier scholarship's use of a Persian term, which was applied to gender or sexual diversity, that of bardash, and in the 1990s proposed instead the term two-spirit. I and others often use both those part of and not part of the First Nations communities for gender diverse individuals. But the preference, especially in the 21st century, is specifics. What does this particular First Nation or Indigenous person's culture call this gender category, such as my use here of Lahamana over others. But of course, language is evolving. And I think one of the beauties of biography is we show the diversity within these broader categories, whether it's people of one particular nation or time or, umbrella gender category. So some thoughts there.
Oh, I wanted to help with Jonathan's answer. Jill Lepore in the New York Times was asked last week, the week before, if she could have someone write her biography. Who would she want to write her biography? She said, no historian wants anybody to be their biographer. It's and maybe if we keep that in mind when we start doing someone else's biography, then we might be gentle. I would like to point out one thing about women's history. I'm engaged in a larger project. I've already published the first part of it on Annie Besant in India. And what makes her unique, her life unique, is how visible the circles of women are in her campaign to protect child labor in Britain, to become a socialist, to become a theosophist, and become actually someone whose ideas about Indian independence, I would argue, were actually more accurate than Gandhi, although he's my father and my own hero. And what's interesting is there is one point, and I'll leave it at this, where the British government, whose cabinet members all had wives who were theosophists, said they've got to arrest this woman and get her out of her activity because their wives were making their lives miserable. And of course, you have to read that very carefully because it's meant to be just a little throwaway for the aristocrat. But the power element of it becomes very clear as you go through the literature. She herself became an incredible intellectual because she was raised by a very wealthy woman. And yet what I want to emphasize here as I finish, she was also in the presence of great men who respected her. The Fabians, for example, and others. And she learned from them and they learned from her. And you'll see in Tagore and others, the interplay between men and women. You don't find in every woman leader, but there are openings that happen in people's lives. And sometimes they actually make the people what they are. Anyway, thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, there's some great teaching resources that are showing up in the comments if people want to make sure you take a look at that before we part ways today. There's a question here from Rodney. Is one of the chief problems in writing about women in a man's life simply the issue of sources? For instance, one cannot read a biography of the Victorian explorer Richard Burton without much of the biography being partly that of his wife. Isabel wrote extensively and left much material about her and her husband. How often is such women's writings available to biographers? That's a very interesting question.
Yeah, I'll just speak about my experience with Leopoldina. So I grew up in Brazil, and I surveyed my high school classmates. I took História do Brasil in Brazil in 10th grade, and I surveyed them with, well, so what are your impressions of Empress Leopoldina? And I was met with blank stares. And then also one of my classmates who was very good, liked history, he just said, oh, she was a nobody. And we know more about the mistress than we know about her. And part of the problem, I think, is that is again to the question of accessing the resources and making them well known. I was able to dig into her story because I was able to track down her letters home. And I'm fluent in Portuguese. So that helped tremendously to take a look at her transformation. But, it really depends on the time and the place. I think historians have to get very creative. There's new work out on Chabi, the second wife of Kublai Khan. And it's fantastic in that it dives into her economic agency. And of course, we have one main source on her from the relatively contemporary, that is The Secret History of Mongols, the Yuan Shi, which describes her economic agency a little bit in the way she managed her household, that she was given a household to manage in Urdu. So that's where historians have to get very creative, and I believe collaborate with other scholars, with researchers who are fluent in other languages, so we can really crowd share the sources. That's my take on that.
I just want to echo that great point, Suzanne. I think collaborative research is really important. And I found in the classroom, these problems of sources are very, very real, especially if we want to look at, other social classes beyond, elites and these many, hidden figures in history. But they're also fabulous opportunities to engage your students, to look at layers of translation, whether it's gender and pronouns or, Eurocentric connotations that are imposed on these figures' lives, or, very negative reporting, and really contextualizing it or looking, beyond written registers and sources, but I think they can be really fabulous in ways to illuminate. I'm thinking of like the ending of Abina and the important men here as I'm talking, but to really illuminate and celebrate the work of the historian, especially for college and K through 12 students. So back to kind of our shared passion and commitment to teaching and inspiring new research, I think biographies work really, really well compared to maybe some other topics.
And it seems to me that writing biographies of people who have been written about a lot is even in some ways more difficult than having a very limited body of information and sources. And I think that this maybe points to a very important use in the classroom of memory and monuments changing across generations. Hatshepsut, is a great example of Victorian gentlemen creating this, image of the shrewd and manipulative soap opera-ish pharaoh, and then later feminists, generations afterwards, saying, wait a minute, that's not really what was happening here. There was a conscious manipulation of identity and revelation and using monuments. And then the destruction of monuments. So I think there's a lot of classroom use that goes beyond role playing and debates and the rich things that we use a lot, but maybe here's another example that goes beyond the American Civil War monument debate and provides an example for the classroom.
Can I just come in on that, where everybody has spoken, and I know that I really am grateful to Yaari and Suzanne, as well as Candice and Mark, for also mentioning Annie Besant. I think one problem that happens is people who move from one nation to another. For example, Annie Besant, of course, and who, by the way, when she was in prison, actually Tagore wrote against her imprisonment to the government. So that's quite important. And his letter went unanswered. But what happens is, for people like that, Maria Montessori, who actually came to India in 1939 on the invitation of the Theosophical Society you mentioned. And then another woman, Margaret Noble, an Irish woman who is more popularly known as Sister Nivedita. Now, these were all Indian nationalists. And yet a lot of Ireland doesn't know about Margaret Noble anymore. And this is where the gap remains, the lived lives. If they're lived elsewhere, what happens? So Lady Montessori, actually, she was able to not only introduce her method into primary education, but actually developed secondary education while she was in India. And yet, these stories need to be recovered for the world, because these were global women. And they fall between the two stools when they move from one nation to another. So that is another problem that we have about lived lives, and who actually tells the narrative, creates the narrative, and shares it with others.
Very important, yeah. Well, I think we've reached the end of our hour and a half. Amazing. And I just want to thank you, three scholars and our lively audience. There's so many more comments and questions to ponder left aside, but thank you to Bashabi Fraser, thank you to Yaari Felber-Seligman and Suzanne Litrel for joining us, for lending your insights and your strengths and expertise today to today's discussion. I'll turn it over to Laura to close it out.
Well, thank you, Candice, for organizing a fantastic conversation this morning. And thank you very, very much to Yaari Felber-Seligman, Suzanne Litrel, and Bashabi Fraser. That's Fraser with an F. Again, I'm so sorry about that, Bashabi, to have gotten your name wrong on the slide. I want to thank all of you for giving us so much to think about, and for the rest of you for showing up and being part of the conversation, for chiming in verbally and via the chat. The chat will be saved, so we can send those resources back out. We are recording this. We'll condense the recording a little bit and have that posted on the WHA's website, so you can come back and relive some of these great moments and share this material with your friends and colleagues, both researchers and teachers. I want to close with a reminder about 2 upcoming events. Next week, the Southeast WHA is having its conference online, and you can find that at sewha.com.org. And sorry about that. And also the World History Association of Texas, who have just opened their call for papers for their conference on commodities and the world of things. And that call for papers closes on December the 1st. With that, I want to thank very much Carrie and Luke, Carrie Vieira and Luke Scalone, who help keep the lights on at the WHA and keep things functioning so that we can have these terrific conversations. We would love to continue launching these for as long as we are stuck at home, and maybe even longer than that. So thanks everyone for chiming in, and we will see you next time under the Baobab.